Iranian cluster missiles struck the last functioning water treatment and desalination facility in Israel's national water network 30 minutes ago. The last one is gone. Not the first facility, not one of several. The last one. The facility that has been carrying the entire weight of Israel's civilian water supply since the missile strikes that took every other node of the network offline. The facility that 4 million people in Tel Aviv, the communities of the coastal plain, the hospitals running on backup generators, the emergency distribution points that have been the only source of water for a civilian population living without functioning taps for days, all of them depended on as the single remaining source of treated water in the country.
Cluster munitions. Not a single ballistic warhead designed to destroy the facility in one impact. Cluster munitions designed to disperse sub-munitions across the entire facility footprint simultaneously, across the intake infrastructure, across the treatment processing equipment, across the desalination membranes, across the pumping systems, across the output distribution connections, across every component of a facility that cannot function if any one of its critical systems is destroyed. Iran did not strike the last water plant to damage it. It struck it with cluster munitions to ensure that no single repair, no replacement of one destroyed component, no emergency engineering intervention can restore it to operation, because cluster munitions do not create one hole that can be patched. They create hundreds of simultaneous damage points distributed across every system in the target at the same moment. The last working water plant in Israel is not damaged, it is destroyed. And the taps that were running this morning are not running anymore. They will not run again on any timeline that matters to the 4 million people who need water today. What I intend to analyze here is exactly what cluster munitions do to industrial infrastructure that no single warhead strike produces. Why striking the last facility rather than one of several transforms the strategic situation from a water crisis into a water absence. What the Israeli government has and has not told its civilian population about what the destruction of the last water plant means for their immediate survival, what a civilian population with no treated water source and no restoration timeline faces in the days ahead, and why the cluster missile strike on Israel's last working water plant is the most consequential single strike Iran has conducted against Israeli civilian infrastructure in this entire conflict. To understand why this strike is categorically different from the earlier water infrastructure strikes, I need to establish what cluster munitions are and why Iran chose them specifically for this target rather than the ballistic warheads it has been using against every previous infrastructure aim point in this conflict. A ballistic warhead strikes a single point. It produces a crater, a blast radius of destruction around that crater, and structural damage that radiates outward from the impact point with diminishing intensity. Against a large industrial facility like a water treatment and desalination plant, a single ballistic warhead strike destroys the components within its blast radius and leaves the components outside it damaged but potentially repairable. The facility is degraded, its output is reduced, but the components that survived can potentially be repaired, reconnected, and returned to partial operation. That is why the earlier strikes on Mekrot infrastructure, which used standard ballistic warheads against primary facilities, produced a water crisis rather than a water absence. Some components survived, some output continued. The last working water plant has been maintaining reduced but real production by operating at maximum emergency capacity on whatever components earlier strikes left intact. Cluster munitions work differently, and the difference is not a matter of degree, it is a matter of kind. A cluster munition dispenses multiple sub-munitions, each of which is itself an individual explosive device, across a dispersal pattern that covers a defined target area rather than a single impact point. Against an industrial facility the size of a water treatment plant, a cluster munition strike does not produce one large crater surrounded by a blast radius. It produces hundreds of individual detonation points distributed across the entire facility footprint simultaneously. The intake pumps are hit, the pre-treatment filtration systems are hit. The reverse osmosis membranes that perform the actual desalination process are hit. The chemical dosing systems that make treated water safe to drink are hit. The high-pressure pumping systems that move product water to the distribution network are hit. The control and monitoring infrastructure that coordinates every process stage simultaneously is hit. Every system, every component, every piece of equipment that the facility needs to function, hit simultaneously by individual sub-munition detonations distributed across the entire target area. What I observe in that damage pattern is not a repair problem. It is a replacement problem, and the distinction is analytically critical. You cannot repair a facility that has sustained simultaneous damage across every system it contains by replacing one component. You replace one component and 3 others are destroyed. You replace those 3 and the control system that coordinates them is gone. You restore the control system and the intake infrastructure that feeds the entire process is wrecked. There is no sequence of repairs that restores function because the damage is not sequential. It is total and simultaneous. Replacing an entire water treatment and desalination facility, every system, every component, every piece of specialized industrial equipment on the timeline that a civilian population with no treated water source requires is not an engineering challenge that skilled teams working around the clock can solve. It is an impossibility on any timeline that changes the situation for the people who needed that facility to be working this morning. The last working water plant is not coming back. Not in days, not in weeks, not on any timeline that is analytically relevant to what 4 million people are facing right now. What I need to translate now is what a civilian population with no treated water source and no restoration timeline actually faces, because the abstraction of infrastructure destruction needs to be rendered in the human reality it produces to be fully understood. The situation Israel's civilian population is now in is not a water shortage. It is a water absence. That distinction carries more analytical weight than it might initially appear to. A water shortage is a condition where supply is insufficient to meet demand, where rationing, prioritization, and emergency distribution can manage the gap between what is available and what is needed. A water absence is a condition where there is no supply, where there is nothing to ration, where emergency distribution is not managing a gap between reduced supply and normal demand, but is attempting to substitute entirely for a supply that no longer exists. Emergency water distribution at the scale required to substitute entirely for a city's water supply infrastructure does not exist anywhere in the world as a pre-positioned capability. It exists as a humanitarian response that is mobilized after a disaster over days and weeks, assembled from dispersed international resources and deployed through logistics chains that require functioning access routes to operate. Israel does not have days and weeks. It has the water currently in pipes, in tanks, in bottles, on supermarket shelves, and in whatever emergency reserve civil defense prepositioning provided before the water infrastructure came down. That water is finite. When it is consumed, there is nothing behind it. The international humanitarian organizations that respond to water supply crises, the ICRC, UNICEF, the WHO, operate on logistics timelines measured in days from the moment a crisis is identified to the moment water trucking, purification units, and distribution infrastructure can be mobilized and made operational in a conflict zone with a closed airport, a conflict zone where the alternative routing channels that replaced Ben Gurion are operating beyond their designed capacity on military logistics that take priority over humanitarian supply. The humanitarian water response that the international community is mobilizing for Israel's civilian population is not going to arrive on the timeline that the civilian population's biological requirements demand. It is going to arrive on the timeline that a closed airport, an active conflict zone, and an international logistics system that was not prepositioned for this specific scenario allows. Those two timelines are not compatible, and the gap between them is measured in the biological currency of human survival. The hospitals are the dimension of the water absence that is producing the most immediate life-threatening consequences, and that deserve analytical attention separate from the broader civilian population picture. Israel's hospitals were already on backup generators following the power grid strike. They were already managing the water supply crisis produced by the earlier Mekarot infrastructure strikes. They were already operating at surge capacity from weeks of missile campaign casualties. The destruction of the last working water plant has removed the treated water supply that hospital clinical functions depend on at precisely the moment when those hospitals are most dependent on every remaining input continuing to function. Dialysis cannot be performed without water meeting specific purity standards. Surgical sterilization cannot be maintained without water. Wound care cannot be conducted at the standard that infection prevention requires without water. The hospital system that was bending under the accumulated pressure of this conflict is not bending anymore. It is breaking. And the patients inside it, the most medically vulnerable people in a country under sustained attack, are the first to bear the consequences of infrastructure that has been systematically destroyed to the point where the last fallback is gone. There is no fallback behind the last fallback. That is what the word last means in the phrase the last working water plant. And what I observe in the government's silence about that reality is the same pattern that has characterized every previous infrastructure failure communication in this conflict. The Israeli government's response to the destruction of the last working water plant has been silence. There has been no public acknowledgement of what cluster munitions do to industrial infrastructure that a ballistic strike does not. There's been no honest assessment of the restoration timeline communicated to the civilian population. There's been no updated guidance to the 4 million people who were relying on the last water plant's continued operation as the single remaining source of treated water in the country. The civil defense guidance telling civilians to maintain emergency water reserves was issued at the beginning of the conflict, when those reserves could be replenished from a functioning supply. It has not been updated to reflect a situation where there is no supply from which reserves can be replenished. The civilians who consumed their emergency reserves in the days since the earlier water infrastructure strikes, expecting the supply to be restored on the timeline their government had been implying, have nothing. The civilians who maintained their reserves are living on a finite quantity with no replenishment available. And neither group has been told by their government what the honest answer to the question of when the water comes back actually is, which is never, not on this timeline, not from this infrastructure. The geopolitical response to the cluster missile strike is being shaped by the specific weapon Iran chose as much as by the target it struck. Cluster munitions are subject to international humanitarian law restrictions under the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Iran is not a signatory to that convention, but the use of cluster munitions against civilian water infrastructure in a densely populated conflict zone is generating international legal and humanitarian responses that go beyond the strategic analysis of the strike's military consequences. The ICRC has issued an emergency statement characterizing the strike as a potential violation of the prohibition against attacks on objects indispensable to civilian survival under Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. The United Nations Secretary General has called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, specifically to allow emergency water distribution to Israel's civilian population. The allied governments that have been managing their public support for Israel's right to self-defense throughout this conflict are now managing a domestic public opinion environment in which the story is not about military strikes on military targets. It is about cluster missiles destroying the last water plant. That is a story that no allied government can defend to its domestic public on the terms that previous strikes on military and strategic infrastructure allowed. The frame of Israel's right to defend itself does not absorb the image of cluster munitions hitting the last source of drinking water for 4 million civilians. Those are not the same story. And the governments that have been telling the first story cannot simply continue telling it in the face of the second. The Netanyahu government is managing this strike in the context of the most politically unsustainable position any Israeli government has occupied since the founding of the state. The power is out. The water is gone. The airport is destroyed and cannot be rebuilt on any relevant timeline. The American military presence that was sustaining the campaign has withdrawn. The Dimona facility has been struck twice with damage that was never disclosed to the public. Tel Aviv has been set on fire with hypersonic missiles. And now the last water plant, the single remaining source of treated water for the civilian population, has been destroyed with cluster munitions in a way that removes restoration from the available options on any timeline that matters. Each of those events was a crisis in isolation. Together, they are not a collection of crises. They are a collapse, not a military collapse in the tactical sense that battlefield analysts measure, but a civilizational collapse of the infrastructure that modern urban life in a country of 9 million people depends on to function. Power, water, connectivity, each gone in a way that the remaining mechanisms for restoration cannot address on the timeline that 9 million people's survival requires. What I observe when I consider the full arc of what Iran has done in this conflict, from the first radar installations to the last water plant, from ballistic warheads to cluster munitions, from degrading military capability to eliminating civilian survival infrastructure, is a strategic logic that has been building toward exactly this endpoint with a precision that becomes visible only when the full sequence is examined rather than each strike in isolation. The choice of cluster munitions for the last water plant was not arbitrary. It was the weapon specifically suited to converting a repair problem into a replacement problem, to ensuring that the destruction of the last fallback was permanent on the timelines that matter, not merely severe. That level of target-specific weapon selection implies a level of pre-strike intelligence about the facility's internal systems and component dependencies that is itself analytically significant. The open question that the destruction of Israel's last working water plant leaves over this conflict is not a military question. It is not a strategic question in the sense that strategic analysts typically use that term. It is a human question, and it operates on a biological timeline that military and strategic decision-making was not designed to address. How long can a civilian population of 9 million people sustain itself without the infrastructure that sustains modern human life? The answer to that question is measured in days, not in the weeks and months that military campaigns are typically measured in days. And the government that has been managing this conflict in military and strategic timeframes is now managing a situation whose clock is biological, not operational. Iran destroyed the last water plant. The taps have gone dry. The clock that started running the moment the cluster munitions hit is not a military clock. It is a human one. And it does not pause for strategic deliberation, for government communication decisions, or for the international diplomatic process that is now mobilizing in response to what has already happened. It runs at the speed of thirst.